In today's game, we witness the epic destruction of a world-class grandmaster at the hands of the great Magnus Carlsen. In a stunning display of board vision, you're going to see Magnus uncork a savage sacrificial combination that he is somehow able to spot in just a matter of seconds. How Magnus is able to find these tactics so quickly and without any apparent effort never ceases to amaze me and can only be explained by his incredibly advanced and near instantaneous pattern recognition. In the second half of this game, you're going to see a king hunt, which is about as epic as they come, as Magnus chases his opponent's king all the way across the board, quite literally, to the very furthest possible square from where it started. So this game has it all. It was played on chess.com on this most recent titled Tuesday. It is a blitz game. Magnus has the white pieces. He's up against the legendary Russian grandmaster Alexander Rustemov, and he opens the game with e3. This is known as Vonnet Krausch's opening, and I'm probably butchering that name, but it's one of those moves that's not really bad enough to be considered a troll move, but it's not all that great either. I guess you could call it sort of a gateway move to a trolling lifestyle. Alex responds d5, claiming some of that center like every beginner is taught to do. Magnus continues c4, striking at d5. c6 adds support. A few knights come onto the scene. Next is a6. A move which in this opening typically prepares b5, usually after capturing on c4, and very often followed by a quick c5 when the b5 pawn has adequate protection. a6 can also be useful to keep a white piece out of b5 in some lines. Magnus responds queen to c2. It's interesting that he didn't play the more popular and engine-recommended d4. Maybe he just wants to rule out an immediate bishop to f5 from black. Next is e6. Alex is of course waiting on playing the aforementioned d takes c4 until after Magnus has moved his light squared bishop. That way when he recaptures, his bishop will have taken 2 moves to get to c4 instead of just 1. But Magnus now plays b3, a move which makes d takes c4 much less appealing for black since white can now recapture with the pawn, thus maintaining control of both b5 and d5 with the pawn. This also makes available the b2 square for the development of the dark squared bishop. Next is bishop to d6, developing, preparing to castle, d4, knight b to d7, very normal looking, bishop to b2, getting that sniper on the long diagonal, and this is an instructive moment. If you ever find yourself in a position like this and you're sort of torn between castling and making a move like the one played next by Alex, b6, just castle. The more games I analyze, the more apparent it becomes that in the opening especially, the most obvious moves are usually the best moves. Not that b6 is a blunder or anything, but the engine is not impressed, saying that black should have just castled and then followed up with e5 or c5, depending on what white plays next. Alex wants to play a bit more conservatively though. He wants Magnus to come to him, so he's just going to tuck his bishop away on b7, try to stay super solid, stock up on his barrels of wheat and rice, and just hold down the fort Y2K preparation style. Magnus continues bishop to d3. Alex plays his bishop to b7. We have back-to-back castling. Magnus brings a rook to the central d-file opposite the black queen, which brings us to the first significant inaccuracy of the game. Best for black here is rook to e8, but Alex goes for queen to e7 instead, which would be just fine if not for the move e4, now played by Magnus, threatening e5 with a fork. Now the ideal way for black to deal with this, if he could get away with it, would be to play e5. Alex rejected this, seeing that with his queen on e7, it would run him into some problems with e takes d5, c takes d5, and knight takes d5, attacking the queen. Now if knight takes d5, then white can throw in the intermezzo bishop takes h7 check with the winning advantage. Now if black had played the superior rook to e8 with his queen still safely on d8, then here he could play the move e4, forking bishop and knight, which would actually be winning for black. But the best black has here is bishop takes d5, but then white can respond d takes e5, getting ready to ramp up some pressure on the e-file with rook to e1 coming shortly, the consequences of which I'll leave to your imagination as we get back to the game. Where in this position, Alex, probably realizing that e5 is not working, plays the only decent alternative, d takes e4, just giving up his best good central pawn. Magnus recaptures with his knight, and after knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and knight to f6, hitting the bishop, which drops back to d3, we now have another blunderous decision from Alex, who plays c5. A move which, if it were a good move, would be a great move, achieving every Slav player's dream of activating their light-squared bishop on the long diagonal, threatening bishop takes f3 to destroy the health of white's kingside pawn structure. So on the surface, this is looking pretty sweet for Team Black. However, Magnus has a very strong reply, which gives him a winning position. Pause the video and have a look if you feel so disposed. Magnus's most decisive move is not d takes c5, though hats off to you if this was your top choice, since it does give white a big advantage, threatening to capture the knight on f6, followed by the pawn on h7. Of course, the critical question is, what happens if black plays bishop takes f3? Well, I'll just tell you that after pawn takes bishop on d6, and the resulting two-player Pac-Man sort of scenario that you see unfolding before you, white will, one way or another, emerge with a big material plus. But let's see what was played in the game. Magnus, in this position, does not capture on c5, but instead pushes his pawn to d5, which is even stronger. Now, if black doesn't capture the pawn, then there's going to be rook to e1, just increasing pressure on e6, pinning it to the queen. So Alex figures he better play e takes d5 while he can. But do you think Magnus recaptures? Oh no. He's got the much juicier move, rook f to e1, attacking Alex's queen, who must now move to d8. Kind of sad to have to disconnect the rooks like that, but black needs to keep defending the knight on f6, or else bishop takes f6 will shatter his kingside pawn structure. Magnus now captures the pawn on d5, since black was threatening to play d4, shutting his dark squared bishop out of the action. Alex dare not take that pawn on d5, unless he wants to be losing even worse than he already is. Bishop takes d5 would just lose a piece to bishop takes f6, followed by bishop takes h7 check, and rook takes d5. And of course, moving the knight away from the king side would be even more gluttonous for punishment. So what's played is h6. It's probably the best try. At least white's not going to be winning a pawn with bishop takes h7. Additionally, there's no knight to g5 nonsense to worry about, but there is knight to h4, now played by Magnus, ready to pounce into that f5 square. Alex responds with a stern no thank you as he plays bishop to c8, ready to just eliminate that knight once it lands on f5. Magnus says, I insist, with bishop to f5, threatening to trade bishops and then plop his mighty steed into f5. But Alex is not giving up so easily. He now plays knight to d7, uncovering an attack on the knight with his queen. Now white could play bishop to h7 check, followed by knight to f5. And during the live stream of this game, Magnus actually mentioned this and was talking about some potential knight sacrifices on h6 or g7 if black were to respond knight to f6. But the move he ended up playing, g3, just defending, is actually the top choice of Stockfish. He seems to have a really uncanny ability to pick top engine moves, especially once he develops a big advantage, even when his calculations don't seem to be all that deep. So I think some of his incredible intuition is coming into play here. And if you just look at black's kingside and do a quick Kasparov-style count of the attackers versus defenders, you'll see that black is clearly outnumbered and therefore should not expect to survive very long. Alex continues rook to e8, which in the practical sense could be called a blunder, as it gives Magnus a very clear-cut winning tactical sequence, although in fairness, everything is losing for black at this point. The engine suggested putting the knight back on f6, allowing bishop takes c8 followed by knight to f5, although it's already finding some sacrifices for white instead, like bishop to e6. I'm sure that's a fun little rabbit hole to explore, but I'm not going to even go there, since the combination Magnus now plays is much more straightforward, though still far from obvious to the average player. And this is a perfect demonstration of just what it takes to play at Magnus Carlsen's level. During the live stream of this game, Magnus seemed to spot his winning combination virtually instantly, calling rook to e8 a tactical blunder only about 5 seconds after it was played. He then took about 10 seconds explaining the winning sequence that he had, and then another 10 seconds looking for something better. He couldn't find anything, and so he went ahead and played the winning combination that he saw. Pause the video if you'd like to try to spot it. Here's a clue that you probably won't need. It's not rook to e6, which the engine says is crushing as well. What Magnus plays is much more obvious to the human mind. He begins with rook takes e8 check. Now if you said bishop to h7 check, that's also correct, since after queen takes e8, that's what Magnus plays next. It doesn't really matter which move comes first, since after king to h8, now comes the real brilliancy. And if you didn't spot it before, here's your second chance to pause and ponder. It is a sacrifice of a piece with bishop takes g7 check, to which black has but one legal reply, king takes g7. But here comes the knight to f5 with check. Now this wouldn't work if the queen were still on d8, when black could just capture on h7 and be up in material. But because Magnus first traded rooks on e8, drawing the black queen to that square, now if king takes bishop on h7, then knight takes d6 discovered check will win the black queen, which is why Alex plays king to f8. Magnus could now capture the bishop on d6 with a winning position, but instead he glances down at his WWSD bracelet, asks himself the question, what would Stockfish do, and then proceeds to demonstrate the correct response, which is queen to d2. No need to capture the bishop on d6 when you can threaten checkmate in one move with queen takes h6. Alex answers that with queen to e5, giving his king a square on e8. The h6 pawn falls. The king steps out of check. Magnus now captures the bishop on d6 with the knight, with check, defended by the queen. Here Alex would surely love to be able to run towards the king side with king to d8. However, this would allow knight takes f7 with check and a fork, winning the black queen. So he's got to try king to e7. Now as white, if you want to win as efficiently as possible, then you got to play knight takes f7, which the engine says is a forced mate in 15. And Magnus actually mentioned this move during the game, but after king takes f7, he was apparently only looking at bishop to g6 check as the follow-up, although much better is the devastating queen to g6 check. I'm not going to delve into that though, since Magnus's move knight to f5 check is totally crushing as well. It's just going to make hunting down black's king take a bit longer, since this move gives the monarch a little head start towards the queen side now via d8. Magnus continues d6, keeping the king out of c7, so Alex plays bishop to b7, looking to run to c8 instead. Next is queen to h4 check. Alex blocks with f6. He's probably trying to avoid trading queens since he is 2 pawns down, although if he played queen to f6 instead, then white should not play queen takes f6, since after the knight recaptured, his bishop would be trapped on h7. But after f6, we have bishop to g6, threatening to come into h8 with the queen. Alex can see that coming and so plays knight to f8, so that after queen to h8, he now has king to d7, with his knight defended by his rook. Magnus continues queen to g7 check. It is the best move, driving the king to c6. We have queen to c7 check, defended by the pawn. King to b5, it's the only move. Magnus now captures the bishop on b7, just keeping things relatively simple for the lowest possible cost, which is that he's sacrificing checkmate in 11 with knight to d4 check, his best move, for a checkmate in 12 with this move queen takes b7. Of course, that's assuming Alex will defend like an engine, which he will not. Now you'll notice that white's bishop is hanging here, but black should not capture it with knight takes g6, assuming he wants to prolong his misery. And it's not because his rook on a8 is hanging, it's actually because this removes defense from the d7 square and so allows a mate in 6 beginning with queen to d7 check, followed by queen to a4, when just like that, Bob has become your uncle. Not going to expound on that twisted family tree, but let's take a look at the move Alex plays after the bishop is captured on b7, which is rook to d8. A beautiful move in a hopeless position, getting that rook out of danger while guarding that d7 square. Magnus again misses his quickest mate, which is still knight to d4 check, clearing the way for bishop to d3 next, as he plays d7, which is probably simplest, threatening knight to d6 check on the next move. Alex could now capture the bishop on g6, but he opts for knight to e6 instead, probably hoping that his knight will in some way be able to aid in the defense of his soon-to-be cornered king. Spoiler alert, it won't, because Magnus now has a forced checkmate in 6 beginning with knight to d6 check, which black can best delay by sacrificing his queen on d6. Alex is of course not going to do that. If king to a5, then knight to c4 check is a fork of king and queen. So what's played is king to b4, but now we have checkmate in 3, starting with queen takes b6 check. Now whether black plays king to a3 or king to c3, white can deliver mate with the same two moves, queen to a5 check, followed by knight to c4 check mate. Alex chooses king to a3, but here Magnus begins with the wrong move, knight to c4 check, turning his checkmate in 2 into a checkmate in 3, since this allows Alex to capture the pawn on a2. But now we have bishop to b1 check, king to a1, after which Magnus turns his checkmate in 1 with queen to a5 checkmate into a checkmate in 2 as he plays bishop to c2 discovered check, and after king to a2, now we have queen to a5 checkmate. The fugitive king, after being pursued into the very heart of enemy territory, is finally caught, bringing his epic journey to a brutal end. So I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. If so, don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and or a comment. Those things always help support the channel, and I will see you soon.